A fox brings food to a lost child in the forest. What it does after will surprise you. A single sharp cry echoed through the dense moonlit forest, a sound so haunting it made the trees themselves seem to shudder. It wasn't the cry of an animal, nor was it fully human. It was something in between, raw, desperate, and filled with fear. Beneath the tangled canopy of ancient oaks and pines, a small figure huddled in the shadows, her knees drawn tightly to her chest. Her breath came in uneven gasps, visible in the frosty night air. Ella was only 7, her oversized sweater stained with mud, and her shoes soaked through from trudging aimlessly for hours. She had ventured into the woods earlier that day, chasing the brilliant orange wings of a monarch butterfly, but the sun had set quickly, swallowing her world in darkness. Now she was lost, and every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, seemed to carry with it the promise of something terrifying. The forest was alive, but not in the way Ella had imagined during her storybook daydreams. This wasn't the friendly, whimsical realm of talking animals and kind-hearted fairies. Here the wind whispered secrets to the trees, and unseen creatures prowled the underbrush, their eyes glinting faintly in the pale light of the crescent moon. Ella's stomach growled, a hollow reminder of the sandwich she had abandoned hours ago when the thrill of the chase had taken over. Suddenly, a different sound broke the silence. It wasn't the howl of a wolf or the eerie hoot of an owl. It was the soft patter of paws against damp leaves. Ella froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She peered into the darkness, but her human eyes could barely penetrate the thick veil of shadows. Then, out of the gloom, it appeared. A fox. Its coat was a vibrant rust red, the color of autumn leaves, and its bushy tail swished behind it as it moved with an almost regal grace. But there was something unusual about this fox. It didn't slink or dart away like a typical wild animal. Instead, it stopped a few feet from Ella, tilting its head as if studying her. Its amber eyes glowed with a strange intelligence, and in its mouth it carried something. Ella blinked, her fear momentarily replaced by confusion. The fox carefully laid its prize on the ground, a crumpled brown paper bag. Then, as if urging her to take it, the fox nudged the bag closer with its nose, before sitting back on its haunches, watching her expectantly. "Is this for me?" Ella whispered, her voice trembling. She wasn't sure why she was talking to an animal, but something about the fox made her feel as though it understood. The fox gave a slight nod, at least it seemed like a nod. Hesitant, Ella reached for the bag, her fingers trembling as she opened it. Inside, she found a small loaf of bread, slightly stale but perfectly edible, and a handful of berries. Tears welled up in her eyes. She was too hungry to question where the food had come from or why this fox was offering it to her. She took a bite of the bread, savoring its simple taste like it was the finest meal she'd ever had. As she ate, the fox remained by her side, its presence oddly comforting. But just as Ella began to feel a flicker of hope, the fox's ears pricked up, its head snapped toward the darkness, and a low growl rumbled in its throat. "What is it?" Ella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The fox didn't answer, of course. Instead, it rose to its feet, its body tense and alert. Ella's stomach churned with unease. Something was out there. Something that had been watching her long before the fox arrived, and judging by the fox's reaction, it wasn't friendly. The air seemed to grow colder, and the trees loomed taller as Ella clutched the paper bag tightly, her eyes darting nervously between the fox and the shadows. She had thought being alone was the worst thing that could happen to her. But now, as the forest came alive with unseen threats, she realized she was wrong. The fox turned back to her, its amber eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. Then, with a flick of its tail, it stepped closer, placing itself between her and the encroaching darkness. Whatever was out there, the fox wasn't going to let it reach her. Ella didn't know why this strange, otherworldly creature had come to her aid, but as she gripped the last piece of bread in her trembling hands, one thing was clear. The fox was more than it seemed, and the night was far from over. The fox's growl deepened, reverberating through the stillness like a warning bell. Ella instinctively huddled closer to the creature, her small hands clutching the paper bag as if it were a lifeline. Whatever was out there didn't seem to fear the darkness, and its presence pressed down on her like an invisible weight. The forest had gone unnervingly quiet. Even the rustling leaves and distant hoots of owls had ceased, as though every living thing was holding its breath. Ella's own breathing grew shallow as she strained her ears, trying to detect what the fox had sensed. Then it came. A faint rustle, too deliberate to be the wind. Ella's heart leaped into her throat. The sound grew louder, closer, and now she could make out the crunch of leaves underfoot. She turned to the fox, her voice trembling. "What's out there?" she whispered. The fox didn't look at her. Its amber eyes were locked on the darkness, its fur bristling as it crouched low to the ground. Ella wasn't sure what terrified her more, the unseen threat or the fox's unwavering focus on it. And then she saw it, a pair of eyes, glowing faintly in the shadows, watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. They were too high off the ground to belong to a creature like the fox, and too steady to be a trick of the light. As the figure stepped closer, its shape became clearer. It was a large, hulking animal with matted fur and jagged claws that glinted in the moonlight, a wolf. But something about it wasn't right. It moved with an unnatural slowness, its head tilted at an odd angle as if studying its prey. Ella could feel its gaze boring into her, and she realized with a sinking dread that she was the prey. The fox barked sharply, snapping her out of her daze. It positioned itself between her and the wolf, its body tense and ready to spring. Despite being much smaller than the predator, the fox showed no hesitation, its determination radiating like a protective shield. Ella clung to the fox's courage, her own fear momentarily giving way to awe. She had never seen an animal behave like this. It was as though the fox had chosen her, decided she was worth protecting even at its own risk. The wolf took another step forward, its lips curling back to reveal yellowed teeth. A low growl rumbled from its throat, deeper and more menacing than anything Ella had ever heard. The fox responded with a sharp yip, its tail lashing like a whip. Then, in a blur of movement, the wolf lunged. Ella screamed, stumbling backward as the fox darted forward to intercept the attack. The two animals collided with a ferocity that shook the ground, their snarls and growls echoing through the forest. Ella could only watch in horror as the fox, smaller and seemingly outmatched, fought with a feral intensity. The wolf snapped its jaws, narrowly missing the fox's tail as it leaped aside. The fox countered with a quick, precise bite to the wolf's flank, its movements so swift they seemed almost calculated. But the wolf was relentless, and it wasn't long before it had the fox pinned against a fallen log. "No," Ella cried, her voice breaking. She didn't know what she could do to help, but she couldn't just stand there. Grasping a nearby branch, she mustered all her strength and hurled it at the wolf. The branch struck its side with a dull thud, not enough to hurt it, but enough to distract it. The wolf snarled, turning its attention to Ella. Her heart pounded as the predator took a step toward her, its teeth bared and its eyes blazing with fury. She scrambled backward, searching desperately for another weapon, but there was nothing within reach. Just as the wolf prepared to lunge, the fox surged forward, sinking its teeth into the wolf's hind leg. The wolf yelped, twisting around to face its smaller opponent. The fox seized the opportunity, slipping between the wolf's legs and positioning itself back in front of Ella. The wolf hesitated now, its growl faltering as it sized up the situation. It seemed to realize that this wasn't going to be an easy meal. With one last snarl, it retreated into the shadows, its glowing eyes lingering for a moment before disappearing completely. The forest was silent once more. Ella collapsed to her knees, her entire body trembling. The fox turned to her, its fur matted and a fresh scratch running along its side, but its eyes were as steady as ever. It nudged her hand gently as if to reassure her. "Thank you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. She reached out to touch the fox, her fingers brushing its soft fur. But the moment of relief was short-lived. A new sound reached her ears, a faint rustling, different from the wolf's heavy steps. This sound was lighter, more deliberate, as if someone or something was watching them. The fox stiffened, its ears swiveling toward the noise. Ella's breath caught in her throat. Whatever was out there wasn't done with them yet. "Is it another wolf?" she asked, her voice barely audible. The fox didn't answer, of course, but it didn't move either. Instead, it stood its ground, its body tense and its eyes scanning the darkness. Ella clutched the paper bag tightly, her fingers trembling. She didn't think she could survive another encounter like the last one. But the fox had saved her once, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't done saving her yet. As the rustling grew louder, a new thought crept into her mind, one that sent a chill down her spine. What if the fox wasn't just protecting her from the forest? What if it was protecting her for something? Ella clung tightly to the paper bag, her legs weak beneath her as the rustling in the bushes grew louder. She felt her pulse in her ears, every beat a reminder of how precarious her situation was. The fox stood firm in front of her, its amber eyes scanning the shadows with unwavering focus. Then, out of the underbrush, a figure emerged. At first, it looked like another animal. Its low posture and deliberate movements suggested caution rather than aggression. But as it stepped into the faint moonlight filtering through the trees, Ella's breath hitched. This creature wasn't like anything she had ever seen. It was a large, sleek animal, with a silvery coat that shimmered like liquid under the pale light. Its eyes, an unnatural shade of emerald green, seemed to glow as they locked on to Ella and the fox. There was something unsettlingly intelligent about its gaze, as if it was calculating every move before it made it. The fox let out a low growl, but it wasn't one of aggression. Instead, it sounded like a warning, almost a plea. The silver creature tilted its head, its ears twitching slightly. Then, to Ella's surprise, it sat down. "What is that?" Ella whispered, more to herself than to the fox. The fox didn't respond, of course, but its tense posture relaxed slightly. It took a step back, glancing at Ella as if to say, "Stay where you are." The silver creature sniffed the air, its gaze flickering between Ella and the fox. Then, with deliberate slowness, it stood and approached. Ella felt her instinct scream at her to run, but her legs refused to move. Something about the creature's presence was both terrifying and oddly reassuring. When it was just a few feet away, the silver animal stopped. It crouched low to the ground, its nose twitching as it inspected the fox. The two animals locked eyes, and for a moment, it felt as though they were communicating in a language Ella couldn't understand. Then, without warning, the silver creature turned its attention to Ella. She froze as it stepped closer, its emerald eyes piercing through her like twin beacons. It didn't feel predatory, but there was an undeniable weight to its gaze, as if it could see every thought, every fear, every hope she had ever held. The creature tilted its head again, and Ella felt a strange warmth wash over her. It wasn't physical, it was more like an understanding, a silent reassurance that she was safe. She didn't know how she knew this, but she felt it deep in her bones. The fox let out a soft chuff, breaking the moment. The silver creature blinked and stepped back, its focus shifting to the paper bag in Ella's hands. It sniffed the air again, its nose wrinkling slightly, and then turned back toward the bushes it had come from. Ella's heart raced as she watched it retreat. "Wait!" she called out, her voice shaky. The creature paused, looking over its shoulder. For a brief moment, its glowing eyes softened, and Ella could have sworn she saw something akin to a smile cross its face. Then, with a flick of its tail, it disappeared into the shadows. The forest seemed to exhale. The oppressive tension that had hung in the air lifted, leaving Ella feeling both relieved and bewildered. "What just happened?" she murmured, looking down at the fox. The fox didn't answer, of course, but it seemed more at ease now. It nudged her leg gently, as if encouraging her to keep moving. Ella hesitated. She didn't know where she was going or how she would get there, but something about the silver creature's presence lingered in her mind. It hadn't just come to inspect them, it had come to guide them. She was sure of it. With a deep breath, she straightened her shoulders and followed the fox as it led her deeper into the forest. The path ahead was uncertain, but Ella couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't as alone as she thought. The forest was unrelenting. As Ella trudged behind the fox, her body began to falter. The chill of the night seeped into her bones, and the uneven terrain made every step feel like a battle. Branches clawed at her skin, leaving faint scratches, and the soft soles of her shoes offered little protection against the jagged rocks and gnarled roots beneath her feet. The fox pressed onward, its tail swaying like a metronome in the dim light. Ella could barely keep up, her breaths ragged and sharp. "Wait," she called, her voice breaking. The fox paused and turned to look at her, its amber eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place, concern, perhaps, or maybe impatience. I need a minute, she panted, sinking to her knees. The forest around her seemed to mock her weakness, the rustling leaves whispering secrets she couldn't decipher. The fox approached her cautiously, sniffing at her hands. It nudged her shoulder with its nose, urging her to rise. "I'm trying," Ella whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "I'm trying, okay?" Just as she pushed herself back to her feet, a low growl rippled through the air. Ella froze, her blood turning to ice. The fox's ears perked up, and it immediately positioned itself between her and the source of the sound. From the shadows emerged a pair of glowing eyes, followed by the hulking form of a predator. A wolf, its fur matted and its teeth bared. Ella's mind screamed at her to run, but her legs were rooted in place. The wolf growled again, its gaze locked on the fox. The fox stood its ground, its tail bristling, and its teeth exposed in a snarl. "Please, no," Ella whispered, her voice trembling. The wolf lunged. The fox darted to the side, leading the wolf away from Ella. The two animals clashed in a flurry of snarls and fur, their movements too quick for Ella to follow. She could only watch in horror as the fox valiantly defended her, and then as suddenly as it began, the fight was over. The wolf retreated into the shadows, its growls fading into the distance. The fox stood victorious, but wounded, a gash running along its side. "No," Ella breathed, rushing to the fox's side. It whimpered softly, but its eyes remained sharp and alert. "You saved me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Why would you do that?" The fox didn't answer, of course, but its steady gaze told her everything she needed to know. Before she could tend to the fox's injury, the silver creature from before reappeared. It stepped out of the shadows with a grace that seemed almost otherworldly. Ella felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension at its arrival. The silver animal approached the fox, its glowing green eyes scanning the wound. Then, to Ella's astonishment, it leaned down and began to lick the gash. "What are you doing?" Ella asked, her voice barely a whisper. The silver creature's actions were deliberate, its tongue moving with precision over the fox's injury. Slowly, the wound began to close, the bleeding subsiding as if by magic. Ella could hardly believe her eyes. "What are you?" she murmured. The silver creature didn't respond, but it turned its gaze to Ella, its eyes filled with a wisdom that seemed far beyond anything human or animal. The fox stood, its strength restored. It nuzzled the silver creature in thanks before returning to Ella's side. The trio continued their journey, the silver creature now walking alongside them. The forest's challenges grew more intense. An icy river blocked their path, its currents fierce and unyielding. Ella hesitated at the edge, her mind racing. "We can't cross this," she said, panic rising in her chest. The fox barked softly, and the silver creature stepped forward. It waded into the river, its movements calm and steady. It turned back to Ella, as if beckoning her to follow. "I can't," Ella whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'll drown." The fox nudged her leg, its encouragement unwavering. Gathering her courage, Ella stepped into the freezing water. The current immediately pushed against her, threatening to sweep her away, but the silver creature was there. It positioned itself beside her, its strong body acting as a buffer against the rushing water. Step by step, they made their way across. By the time they reached the other side, Ella was shivering uncontrollably, her clothes soaked through. But she was alive, and that was all that mattered. The challenges didn't end there. Hunger gnawed at her stomach and exhaustion threatened to overtake her. But every time she felt like giving up, the fox and the silver creature were there, guiding her, supporting her. Through it all, Ella began to feel a connection to her unlikely companions, a bond forged in the crucible of survival. She didn't know why they had chosen to help her, but she was grateful beyond words. As the sun began to rise, casting its golden light over the forest, Ella felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't out of danger yet, but for the first time she believed she might make it out alive. The first rays of dawn filtered through the dense forest canopy, illuminating the trio as they ventured deeper into the wilderness. Ella's steps, though weary, had newfound determination. The fox stayed close to her side, its amber eyes flicking between her and the path ahead, while the silver creature moved silently, a spectral guardian in the early morning light. The forest seemed calmer now, the predatory sounds of the night replaced by a chorus of birdsong. Ella dared to hope that their ordeal might soon end, but then a sharp, unfamiliar cry echoed through the trees, freezing her in place. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The silver creature's ears twitched, and it exchanged a glance with the fox. Without warning, it darted ahead, disappearing into the thick undergrowth. "Wait! Don't leave us!" Ella called, panic surging. The fox nudged her leg, urging her forward. Reluctantly she followed, her heart pounding in her chest. They emerged into a small clearing, and what Ella saw made her gasp. In the center stood the silver creature, its body tense and alert. Surrounding it were figures cloaked in dark robes, their faces obscured by hoods. They moved with an eerie synchronicity, circling the creature like predators closing in on their prey. "What's going on?" Ella whispered, clutching the fox instinctively. One of the hooded figures stepped forward, lowering its hood to reveal a weathered face etched with lines of age and wisdom. The figure spoke, its voice a low, commanding rumble. "You shouldn't be here," it said, its gaze locking onto Ella. Ella's mind raced. I got lost," she stammered. "The fox and the silver, they saved me." The figure's expression softened slightly, but there was an undercurrent of tension in its demeanor. "That creature is not what you think," the figure said, gesturing to the silver being. Ella frowned, confusion clouding her thoughts. "What do you mean?" The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it turned to the silver creature. "You've broken the covenant," it said, its tone accusatory. The silver creature stepped forward, its glowing green eyes unyielding. It emitted a low, melodic sound, a language Ella couldn't understand, yet it resonated deeply within her. "What covenant?" Ella demanded, her frustration bubbling over. "What's happening?" The figure sighed, turning back to her. "This forest has its guardians," it said, "the silver one among them, but their purpose is not to interfere in human affairs. It was forbidden to guide you, and yet it did." Ella's heart sank. "It helped me survive," she said, her voice rising. "It saved my life, and in doing so it may have condemned itself," the figure replied grimly. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Ella looked at the silver creature, a lump forming in her throat. She couldn't understand why it had risked so much for her, but she couldn't let it face punishment for its kindness. "Please," she said, stepping forward. "If it broke a rule, it was because I needed help. Punish me, not it." The figure studied her for a long moment, its eyes narrowing. "You would take its place?" Ella hesitated, fear clawing at her resolve. But then she looked at the silver creature and the fox, and the memories of their sacrifices flooded her mind. "Yes," she said firmly. "I would." A murmur rippled through the cloaked figures. The leader raised a hand, silencing them. "Very well," it said. "The bond you have formed with these creatures is rare and it cannot be undone. But the path forward will not be easy." The silver creature emitted a soft, mournful sound, stepping closer to Ella. Its eyes glowed brighter, and for the first time she felt a warmth emanating from it. A silent "thank you." "What happens now?" Ella asked, her voice shaking. The figure pointed to the forest. "You must leave this place, but know this. The bond you share has a cost. The Silver One's fate is now tied to yours. Should you falter, so will it. Protect each other, and perhaps you will find your way." Before Ella could respond, the cloaked figures began to fade into the mist, their forms dissolving like smoke. The clearing grew quiet once more, leaving Ella, the fox, and the silver creature alone. "I don't understand any of this," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. The silver creature nuzzled her gently, its touch comforting. The fox barked softly, its tail wagging. Despite the uncertainty, Ella felt a glimmer of hope. Whatever lay ahead, she knew she wasn't alone. Together, they would face whatever challenges came their way. As the trio made their way out of the clearing, Ella turned back for one last look. The forest seemed different now, less menacing and more alive. She couldn't explain it, but she felt a deep connection to this place, as though it had become a part of her. The journey ahead would be long and fraught with danger, but Ella was ready. She had her companions, and she had her resolve. And as the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, she knew they would find their way, together. The forest stood still, a living witness to the tale it had silently nurtured. Sunlight dappled through the thick canopy, casting shimmering patterns on the mossy ground as Ella, the fox, and the silver creature emerged from the dense shadows into an open glade. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Ella saw the clear, vast expanse of the sky, its brilliant blue stretching endlessly overhead. Her legs trembled, exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her, but her heart swelled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. She glanced down at the fox, its tail swishing gently as it padded beside her, and then at the silver creature, its eyes glowing faintly with an ethereal green light. "Do you think we'll ever come back here?" she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was asking. The fox tilted its head as though contemplating the question, while the silver creature made a soft, melodic hum. Ella smiled faintly. Even without words, their answers were clear. The forest had been a place of terror, of trials, and of unexpected connections, yet it was also a place of profound transformation. Ella had entered it as a frightened, lost girl, but she was leaving it as something else, stronger, braver, and forever changed. As they crossed a narrow stream, Ella paused, kneeling by the water's edge. She splashed her face with the cool, refreshing water, staring at her reflection. The face that stared back at her was familiar, yet different. Her eyes held a depth they hadn't before, a quiet resilience born from the trials she had endured. She turned to the silver creature whose shimmering form seemed more solid in the daylight. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. The creature tilted its head, the glow of its eyes pulsing gently. It emitted a sound, a sequence of tones that Ella couldn't decipher, yet it resonated deeply within her as though it carried an unspoken truth. "You didn't have to," she continued, her voice cracking. "But you did. And I'll never forget it." The fox barked softly, breaking the moment. It nudged Ella's leg, urging her to move forward. Ella rose to her feet, brushing dirt from her hands. The glade stretched before her, leading to the edge of the forest where the trees thinned and gave way to open fields. She could see the faint outline of a village in the distance, her village. But even as she took her first step toward home, a pang of sadness tugged at her heart. She turned to the silver creature, realizing that their time together might be coming to an end. "Are you leaving?" she asked hesitantly. The creature stepped closer, lowering its head until it was level with hers. Its eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment she felt a flood of emotions, gratitude, sorrow, and a strange, unshakable bond. The creature's form began to shimmer, its edges blurring as though it were dissolving into the very air around them. Panic surged in Ella's chest. "No, wait!" she cried, reaching out, but the silver creature remained still, its glowing eyes softening. It let out one final melodic tone, a sound so filled with emotion that it brought tears to Ella's eyes. Then, with a final pulse of light, it vanished, leaving only a faint shimmer in the air where it had stood. Ella fell to her knees, clutching the spot where the creature had been. The fox pressed close to her, offering silent comfort. For a long moment, she sat there, tears streaming down her face. But as the warmth of the sun touched her skin, she took a deep breath, letting the air fill her lungs. The silver creature was gone, but its presence lingered. In the soft rustle of the leaves, in the gentle breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers, and in the strength she now carried within her. Ella rose to her feet, the fox at her side, and began the journey home. As she walked, she thought of everything she had endured, everything she had learned. She thought of the creature's sacrifice and the bond they had shared, and as the village drew closer, a sense of peace washed over her. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she was ready to face it. The forest had changed her, shaped her into someone stronger, someone braver. Ella glanced down at the fox, who looked up at her with bright, trusting eyes. "We'll be okay," she said, her voice steady. "We'll be okay." The forest behind them was silent now, its secrets tucked away among the ancient trees, but Ella knew it would always be a part of her, just as she would always be a part of it. And as the sun climbed higher into the sky, casting its golden light over the world, Ella walked on, carrying with her the lessons of the forest, the memory of the silver creature, and a heart filled with hope.